Please forgive my spring fever here.
Bless you, Gesundheit.
Thank you, Elliot.
You know, since we have a minute, I wondered if people could introduce themselves briefly in the chat. Just let me know who you are, where you're calling in from, and anything you'd like me to know about what you do. I think we have some mediators in the group, but it would be helpful.
Elliot Herland, mediator, Minnesota.
Hi, Jean Lawler, mediator, and I've been an attorney about a little over 40 years now, Los Angeles. Nice to meet you.
Hi, Jean.
Hi.
Hi, Alex. Colleen Selby. I'm a lawyer and mediator. I'm in Vancouver, Canada. I have been looking at your book with interest. I've ordered it, so eager to hear what you have to say today.
Thank you, Colleen. And I saw Janice's introduction, full-time arbitrator and mediator in California. Welcome, Janice. All right, we look like, yeah, go ahead.
I'm David Baca in Humboldt, Texas. I'm an ordained minister and a professional mediator.
Okay, Natalie, it's 8:02, and out of respect to the people who are here on time, maybe we ought to get rolling. So you're recording this, so let's start. Welcome to Mediation, the New Possibilities Hour, June 4th, 2020. We really appreciate everybody being here to hear this wonderful presentation from Alex Carter. Professor Alexandra Carter of Columbia Law School has become a friend over the last many weeks, and I'm happy to say that. And I'm also happy to say she is the author of the international bestseller, Ask for More, 10 Questions to Negotiate Anything. It's been as high as number 3 on the Wall Street Journal bestseller list. And we know Alex is going to make a wonderful presentation about it. There will be plenty of time for questions and answers. And I'm sure there will be a lot of very timely questions and lively discussion given the extraordinary events in the United States and really around the world of the past week. We are here as part of the Will Work for Food project. We're here to raise money for food banks. So please, if you like what you see, make a contribution of whatever size is comfortable to you, to whatever food bank is in your area or which you favor. And if you're in a position of food insecurity yourself these days, we're happy that many of us are in a position to be able to support food banks and take care of everybody at this very difficult, very challenging time. And now it's time to learn. Natalie, is there anything you'd like to add before we turn it over to Alex?
You know, the only thing that I'd like to say, Jeff, is that we are thrilled to have you join us. We really appreciate your time and your expertise in talking to our industry. And that's it. We look forward to hearing about your book and how it can best serve our industry.
Professor Carter, take it away.
All right, thank you so much, Jeff and Natalie, and to everyone for making the time today and this week. I've spent a lot of time in reflection thinking about how best to talk to you all today. And my thought was, you know, together with Jeff, that I would present a bit about Ask for More and what it represents and the method that's contained in the book, and give some points about how it can be especially relevant for discussing, you know, the most difficult and most important issues of our time, as we are called to do as mediators. And so just a little bit about me, because I'm a clinical professor, which means I practiced mediation at Columbia in New York and in New York City, and also because I mediate in New York City courts, it's impossible to distract me. And so I want you to feel free to ask me your questions at any time. You can pop them in the chat, right? That's what mediators do, right? We answer questions as they come up. If I can answer it right then, I will. And if I need to fold it into another slide, that's fine too. So I'll just let you know that. Why don't we, it looks like the host disabled screen sharing. So now, excellent. Wow, Natalie, that was the fastest recovery I have seen. Congratulations on your Zoom mastery. Okay, wonderful. All right, so I'm going to talk a bit about Ask for More, and briefly, you know, Ask for More, I'm a mediator, but Ask for More is a negotiation book. It brings some of what we do as mediators to the practice of negotiations. One of my goals for the book. And so I'm wondering, you know, how many of you, in fact, you know, when I was in law school, this is what I was taught about negotiation, that basically it's a back and forth over money. So negotiation is for those in the corporate world, you know, once a year when they go in and say, hi, Alex Carter, I had great results for the company this year. Keep me in mind when you're making your compensation decisions. Or negotiation is the transactional back and forth right before people sign a deal. Or in a context many of us are familiar with, negotiation is what happens when people unhappily end up in court and need to find a way to settle their way out of it. Over time, I came really to the belief that this was not an accurate depiction of negotiation, or at least the fullness of negotiation. But it wasn't until I went on my honeymoon to Hawaii in 2006 that it really clicked for me what negotiation is. These days, whether I'm speaking to groups of mediators or groups of corporate executives, social justice activists, or kids, this is how I teach negotiation. You know, and sometimes people look at this and I ask them, what does this have to do with negotiation? And they might say to me, well, I think it's about making the most of limited information, or it's about choosing the right outcome. And it's interesting because really what this picture is about is something so much more basic. You know, when my husband and I were in this kayak on the Wailua River, our guide turned around and said, please negotiate your kayaks to the left so we can wind up on that beach over there. And that was the moment that I thought, that's right. There's more than one way to think about negotiation. One way to think about it is just the transactional back and forth over money. Another way to think about it is when you're negotiating toward a beach, what are you doing? You're steering. And so I teach that negotiation is any conversation in which you are steering a relationship. And just a note here, since we're all, I believe, mediators on this call, or ADR neutrals, you know, yes, negotiation is something that I'm facilitating, right? So when I'm in the room with parties, I am facilitating their negotiation. But in a way, as a mediator, it would be naive to say that I'm not also engaged in steering my relationship with the people in front of me or by my side. That I'm engaged in thinking about how to build trust, where I'm taking that relationship, and being intentional and transparent in all the steps that I take to help us get where they want to go. I've been showing this picture now for a couple of years as I travel around the country and the world teaching about negotiation. The thing is, you know, wouldn't it be nice if this is what life was like? I think instead, the last couple of months have felt, I think for me and for many others, a little bit closer to this, right? Where perhaps it's a little bit less about drinking in the gorgeous scenery and a little bit more about how do I not end up on the rocks? You know, instead of being in a situation where maybe we're landing a bunch of new client work, we're trying to save client relationships or deals that have disappeared. You know, we're in mediations that maybe feel much more rocky in terms of terrain to navigate. And so the good news is that the approach that I teach and that I've learned from being a mediator does work quite well for this. But it also, I can tell through hard-won experience, works exceptionally well for this. And so it's my hope today to give you some thoughts that you can use for both the serene and the stormy times. And we're certainly in the midst of a stormy time at the moment. So this is the sum of the definition of negotiation that I practice and which I set forth right in the beginning of Ask for More. Negotiation is not just the money conversations. It's any conversation in which you are steering a relationship. And so every conversation we have with someone is an opportunity to steer that relationship for mutual gain. You know, I talk a lot to groups of women, and one of the things I talk about is that I'm not waiting for the money conversation to teach someone how to value me, to teach them how to think about me and my expertise. And I'm not waiting until the money conversation to really get to understand somebody else. That's not the first time I'm going to be asking them a good question or seeking to sort of get under the hood and figure out what's going on for them. I'm thinking about piloting my relationships intentionally in every conversation I have. You know, the other thing about a lot of the negotiation books that I had read before, and that definition of it's a back and forth between two people, is that it neglects the most important relationship of your life, which is the one we have with ourselves. If negotiation is steering, that steering has to start at home with us. And that's true both before I enter the room, and these days the metaphorical room, as a negotiator, but just as much before I enter the room as a mediator. If I have read case briefings or I've spoken to parties on the phone, making sure that I have done the internal work to get clear on myself, my emotions that day, my own personal needs, and what's happening for me, so that I can then go into the room and serve the parties from the fullest and the most clear place possible. Okay, so the Ask for More framework is about asking questions. It's 10 questions, 5 that you can ask yourself. This is what I call the mirror section, and 5 that you ask somebody else, and that's the window section. And together, these research-backed and questions that I've come up with from a lot of experience now as a neutral, helping people to resolve conflict, truly can help people get more out of any conversation, whether that is at work, negotiating for themselves, as a mediator, talking with family, or having, you know, some of the more challenging conversations of our lifetime right now. I just want to talk a bit about the mirror and the window for mediators, okay? Because I wrote this book for people who are negotiating. And so under that framework, the mirror is the questions that I ask myself. And then if I'm negotiating with Michelle, right, I go into the room, and the window are the questions that I'm going to ask Michelle. Now, let's assume that instead we're talking about Kimberly serving as a mediator. Now, when I'm working as a mediator, sometimes, frequently, it becomes apparent to me that people haven't known the right questions to ask themselves to really get clear on themselves before they came in the room. And when I see that, sometimes my first function as a mediator is to ask them those questions and hold up the mirror to them. So I want to say that all of the questions in this book, mirror and window, can be used when you are mediating. So I might, for example, you know, if I'm mediating, for example, between Elliot and Chuck, right? I might take a moment to ask Elliot and Chuck each some of the mirror questions to help them get a fuller understanding of each other, and then assist them in opening the window, right? Asking the second half to help bridge the gap. So I'm happy to take any questions throughout this presentation, both on what do I do, Alex Carter, if I am negotiating for myself, and what do I do, Alex Carter, if I am sitting in the chair as a mediator. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is take us through the mirror and window sections. I'm going to give you an overview of each of those sections, and then give you a couple of questions from each. Okay. So first, let me just take a moment to talk about the fact of questions. Part of the reason that Simon & Schuster really loved this book and wanted to publish it is that there's nothing out there right now that is a question-centered approach to negotiation in the popular literature. And so I first wanted to answer the question, what do questions have to do with negotiation and leadership? And it's quite a lot, as it turns out, which would not be a surprise to anybody in this virtual room. So in fact, organizational psychologist research shows that asking ourselves questions is critically important, because one of the main components of leadership is self-awareness. And self-awareness is cultivated by asking oneself the right questions. And so when you engage in that self-inquiry, which doesn't have to take long, these days I'm doing a lot of working through my own questions to deal with some really difficult stuff. And I can do that in under a half an hour. And in under a half an hour, I have gotten clear, I have calmed my emotions, I have, rearranged my priorities, and I've developed an action plan to go forth into my conversation. But it doesn't stop rather with asking ourselves questions. There's been research to show by Professor Lee Thompson out of the Kellogg School at Northwestern that 93% of people are not asking the right questions of somebody else when they get into negotiation. And what kinds of questions are those? They're what she calls diagnostic questions, open questions about the other person's needs, concerns, and goals, right? And I don't know if it's Dea or Daya, but I see you smiling, and in part, which one is it, Dea or Daya?
Sorry, Dea.
Dea, thank you. Okay. I see Dea smiling because this is what we know, right? Which is we get into the room, we ask people open questions, and all of a sudden they're like, oh my gosh, the pie of information is so much larger. Now we know how to make a deal, right? So the amazing thing is, though, may I just say in a personal moment, I'm so good at doing this as a mediator, but how many other people want to bravely admit that when they are negotiating, sometimes they can experience a phenomenon that I call losing access to my skills, right? Where suddenly when I'm on the table, it's harder for me to remember to ask the open questions, right? So that's part of my mission for this book, is bringing mediation skills to the practice of our own negotiation. All right, and a tip on negotiating in a crisis. Again, I think mediators would know this, but I have had people say to me, Alex, I don't really have time to ask questions at the moment, right? And what I tell people is, you don't have time not to ask questions. In a time of crisis, it has never been more important to lead our negotiation with questions. Why? Because in a time of crisis, we need the clarity that we can find by asking ourselves questions. Right now, I think what's happening in society has kind of cracked us wide open to the point where we now have the opportunity to ask ourselves questions that we hadn't before. And I think it's incumbent upon us, before we get into what otherwise, may I just say, as a white person, out there navigating in the world, recognizing that it's not business as usual for anybody, but especially for my Black colleagues. And so thinking about taking a moment to ask myself some questions before I get into conversation can help me really approach it from a much more mindful place, so that I'm less likely to do harm. And when we approach somebody else, of course, leading with questions can really take some of that heat down. I've done whole programs, which Jeff knows and probably has attended, around negotiating during a crisis, and how it is that in times of trauma, for so many people, we can become more reactive. We can lose some of our self-regulation, and also it's harder for us to think and process. When we lead our negotiation by asking other people questions, we increase trust, we take down defensiveness, and we slow it down, right? As mediators, we're all about this. How do we slow it down so that things don't spiral and go in a direction that we don't want? All right, so let's talk about the mirror and the window. Again, the mirror is about starting your negotiation at home with you. It's about steering your own internal conversation before you engage in conversation with somebody else. and I get this question a lot, I would say particularly from women saying, Alex, what's my source of power in negotiation? How do I approach things and feel strong and confident in what I have to offer? And what I tell people is that your source of power in negotiation is not bluster, it's not aggression, it's knowledge. When you know yourself really well and you can rest in that and rest in what you have to offer and what you need at the table. All right, so let's talk about a couple of questions from the mirror section. First question, this is the place that I tell everybody to start their negotiations. What's the problem I want to solve? And the normal examples I give here, sometimes people are in a conflict or they're entering a negotiation and they want to get to the solutions right away. And mediators experience this, right? I've had many lawyers say to me, Professor Carter, I'm sure you know what you're doing. All respect for your experience. Could we please get to the numbers, right? And like, could we solve this? And my answer is always, solve what, right? As mediators, we know this, that the first exercise we engage in is defining the problem. And in fact, when we're mediating, we know that sometimes the issue is people define the problem differently, right? In an employment context, the employer might be thinking, well, or saying, well, it's just this one thing, it's this one promotion that she was denied for, and here's the reason for it. And the complainant comes in and says, it's not about this one promotion, it's about the system, it's about the pattern. And in fact, on a personal note, I just want to say that this replicates some of the conversations that I have seen happening right now. So for example, there's a group that I belong to of law professors across the country. And, last week there was a discussion in that email group where a couple of well-meaning white professors were saying, okay, so let's figure out the problem here. We need to figure out what the maximum is that the officer who murdered George Floyd can be charged with, right? And so they were tossing out, sort of different levels of murder and what the charge could be. And a couple of Black professors chimed in and said, with respect, like, this is not the problem. The problem is, like, how do I keep myself safe? How do I walk around my neighborhood? How do I keep my children safe? How do we ask the questions that are going to enable us to systematically reform and dismantle, a lot of the structures of oppression, right? Again, particularization of the problem, systematically defining the problem. And so, I want to say that this is something that, as a white person and as a white woman, when I walk into spaces, really engaging with, the other person's definition of the problem and disciplining myself to listen and really understand that. Because unless we understand how the other person is defining the problem, we will not have productive conversation from there, and we will not reach healing and agreement. There are ways to think about this that are a little bit more granular, in the mediation room. So if somebody comes in, right, and it's an employment case, what's the problem I want to solve helps me diagnose, is it, okay, so, oh, I see I'm getting a few things. Implicit bias. Yeah, thank you, Elliot. I'm so glad that you brought that up, right? So implicit bias is about, what's our go-to when we define the problem, and I think, there's research to show that for, some white folks, right, we define the problem in the particular, right, and the oppressed group is more likely to see it as a system, right? We're going to say, oh, this is a contract failure, and they're like, no, that's not a contract failure. Here's the much larger failure. Going to the mediation room, what's the problem I want to solve? This really, I find, I help, complainants think about, is this just the promotion that you're looking for? Or, what are your long-term goals? What do you want your life to look like 5 years from now? You know, for some people, it's about the promotion. For others, you know, it may be about systematic change. For others, it may be a monetary problem, right? So really helping people fully define the problem that has brought them in the room helps them achieve not just a result, but a durable result. And isn't that what we want as mediators? Okay. Next question is this. Now, this is a mirror question for negotiators. How have I handled this successfully in the past? And I will say this is a really powerful question for a negotiator to ask herself for two reasons. One, the mere fact of asking this question acts as what's known as a power prime. This comes from research my colleague at Columbia Business School, Adam Galinsky, and others did, where they found that if people thought about a prior success before they went in and negotiated, they were more likely to negotiate better or more successfully. And this question is going to be one that is familiar to a lot of us as mediators, because how many times have we gotten in the room and, you know, the parties in front of us just feel despair, right? Like this problem is so huge and how are we going to solve it? And things went so wrong. And when we remind them or ask them about a time that they have handled something like this successfully in the past, I'm betting there's a lot of mediators there who have found, as I have, that that can be kind of a magic question. It helps us generate data, helps us think about approaches that worked before that might work again in the future. It's also diagnostic, because if I know what worked in the past and then I looked at what happened here, I can say, oh, you know what's occurring to me, guys, now that you talked about this, I can see that this project had several key differences, right? So it helps us diagnose. Here's the thing, you know, I think that it works really well as a mediator to ask people how they've handled something successfully in the past. I've used this over and over again as a negotiator, and it is fantastic. Let me give a couple of examples. You know, these last few months have been really challenging. At the beginning of March, I had a meeting with my literary agents. You know, we went to a restaurant in New York City and they were like, Alex, you're killing it. You got so many in-person events. You got this book tour. Oh my God, you're gonna slay it, right? And then gradually over the following 10 days, everything evaporated. I mean, to the point where Simon & Schuster had a conversation about whether they should pull my book and put it like later in the year or next year. And I wasn't sure what to do. Now, I've never handled, you know, a pandemic before, but I did look back to think about, do I have a prior success that has anything in common with this? And I thought about, okay, I have a short period of time where I have to get the word out, and I'm not going to be able to do it via media. So it's going to have to be like word of mouth, and I'm going to have to like build a campaign for this book. When have I done this before? And I remembered that I had successfully run my husband's campaign for local office 5 years ago. And I did that by building a group of 20 female captains, each of whom lived in a different neighborhood, and we worked together and partnered to get the word out. And so I decided to leave the book in May and replicate that strategy, and it was really successful. You know, I've also had during this time a parent in hospice who then ended up being diagnosed with COVID, and I found out on the day that my book was launched, they wrote to say, we think he has 24 hours. And so I have never dealt with that before, but I had dealt with the very serious illness of a family member before. And in that really desperate moment, I'm not going to pretend that I was calm while I was doing this. I was absolutely not. I was weeping. But I wrote down some things that I had done before during that prior serious illness to help and to cope. And I ended up figuring out several things I could do, including reaching out to some trusted people to help me get through some day-to-day stuff that was really, really useful. So this question, especially during a time of crisis, can really help us marshal our resources and remember things that we have achieved before and help us go out even to cope in the face of the impossible. Okay, so that is the mirror, and boy, that was a look in the mirror, wasn't it? I forgot, we're recording this. That's fine, it's all good. All right, so now we're gonna talk about the window. And this is where we are sitting down with somebody else to ask them open questions in order to create trust, to gather information, and design better solutions. Of course, we know in the mediator community that listening more than you talk generates better deals and more value, especially when we listen first. And the thing is, you know, I don't just want people to get to like one yes or a handshake. My hope for negotiators, just like my hope when I'm sitting in the mediator chair, is not just to help the people in front of me solve one, conflict. Jeff and I have talked about this, but to help them generate relationships where they can solve the next one on their own, and where there's longer term mutual gain that comes out of that one session. So, of course, the first question to ask is, tell me. It's interesting because, sometimes when I teach in workshops, I'll set up a scenario where I tell people, I just went on a family vacation back when you could do that. And I said to people, it's your mission to get the most information out of me possible. What would you like to ask me? And a lot of times it's amazing, right? What do you think the first question is people ask me? They're trying to get the most information out of me possible. And they're like, okay, I'm going to ask a really great question. Anybody want to guess what the first question usually is? And I'm telling you, I've gotten this from mediators too.
Where did you go?
Where'd you go?
Yes, 100%. That is exactly right. Where did you go is the number one question. And of course, we know the answer to that is Cape Cod or Mexico. Now, if we're on the phone, right, if I'm on the phone with Michelle and I say, where did you go? Michelle is probably going to do me a favor and over answer the question, right? She can be like, it's great, Alex. I went to Mexico. I did this kayaking thing. I went with my spouse, whatever it might be. But for most people, or people we don't know, or maybe there's a trust issue, I have to tell you, most of the time, where did you go is going to get a one-word answer. And so eventually somebody in the room maybe comes up with, tell me about your family vacation. These days, tell me is the number one question that I use on every occasion. And I think it's because it's the broadest possible way to lead you to who someone is, who they are, where they come from, what they're feeling, right? Because if I ask Michelle, what did you do on your family vacation? That's more open, but it doesn't leave Michelle space to talk about her feelings, right? Or maybe emotionally what was going on for her on that vacation. So, tell me is a wonderful question. Normally when I speak to business people, I give them examples of how just asking this one question, can close a deal. But, on a more personal note, I want to say that I find it to be much better when I'm checking on people during this time than asking them, how are you? I think that, and I see David nodding because I think that a lot of us think that how are you feels like an open question, but it really reads as kind of rote and closed. Most people come to expect, right? If I say, Jean, how are you today? Jean kind of knows that the answer I expect is, I'm doing great, Alex. And then she says, how are you? Instead, I have tried to ask something like, tell me how you're feeling today. Or, tell me what support would be helpful to you. The one thing I will say is right now, I want to be a little bit careful about using, this is really the imperative, right? I want to be careful about using this with people I trust and who I know welcome the conversation. I don't want to approach a random person of color and say, tell me what I can do to be a better ally. No. Right? This is not the time for me to be demanding work of someone. And so that's the one gloss on this that I would say is really to make sure that the other person has indicated that they are open to a conversation. When people come into my office as a mediator, I do. I say, tell me what's brought you here. I don't say, tell me, what's your legal claim or what are your defenses? And my students sometimes when they're first being trained, they think that's what they're supposed to ask because they're law students. And so the hammer's going out to nail all the nails. And I say, no, tell me is about figuring out the other person's definition of the problem. And so that's what we want to do with this question. Okay, there are lots of other window questions and we can't get to all of them today, but this one is a great one. What are your concerns? I've been teaching this recently because I found that this is my number one sort of turn a no to a yes, or number one barrier breaker for negotiations during COVID. A lot of times when people are engaged in conversation or in negotiation right now, they may, I just want to go back for a second. Chuck gave us a good gloss and saying, would you be willing to tell me, right? Yeah, I think, Chuck, we could certainly play with that during this time if we're not sure that the person welcomes the conversation. Thank you for that addition. So going back to this question, what are your concerns? A lot of times during coronavirus, I think people feel so pressured and stressed out that the easiest answer is no, even when, right, there could be a world of deal making and possibility on the other side of a yes. So what I tell people is, if you get a no, and I get this question actually a lot from women who are looking to negotiate for themselves, especially around money. They fear the no. And part of the reason they fear the no is because they don't know what to do on the other side. And I'm like, that's not a problem. No is not a problem because all you need to do is say, okay, thank you. Tell me your concerns, or what are your concerns? And when you sincerely listen to somebody else's concerns, you are hearing the barriers to the deal. And so these days, what are your concerns is the number one question I ask when I'm encountering a barrier of any sort. And I'll just tell a brief story. So I think I mentioned, right, that a lot of my events got canceled. The one thing I was holding on to is my town has a wonderful indie bookstore that is has won awards. It's nationally acclaimed. It's called Words Bookstore. And among other things, it supports families and individuals with autism. They employ a lot of folks on the spectrum in the bookstore. It's one of my favorite places to be. So they had their event with me on their website, and we reached out and said, well, obviously we can't do an in-person book launch event. Could we do something virtual? And they wrote back and said, no, we're not doing virtual events. Yet again, full disclosure, I cried for 5 minutes, head down on the desk. And then I thought, I wrote the book, I'm going to call them. And I called them up and I said, what are your concerns? And they said, number one, we've never run a Zoom event. We don't know how to do it, and we don't have staff to do it. And I said, okay, would it help if I did? Because I've run 1 million of them and I have a paid account and I'd be happy to do all of that. And they said, yes, that would help, but we have another concern. I was like, great, tell me your concern. And they said, our concern is that we don't want to do stuff that's just promotional for Words Bookstore right now when so many people, especially small businesses, are hurting. And so just having a talk, where we go back and forth doesn't really feel like we're serving the public. And so I said, okay, so serving the public is important. What if we didn't do an author talk standard, which is not what I wanted to do anyway? What if we ran a training, a free training for small business owners on how they could negotiate through coronavirus and give them free tips that they could use right now in their business? And he said, that sounds great. What if we also donated to a local food pantry for every person who got on the call? And I was like, you have a deal. And so in a way, this event reminds me of that, right? We created so much value. He said no. If I had not pushed through and said, please tell me your concerns, I would never have known that we were totally aligned. The truth is, I never wanted to do a regular, here's my resume, stand up in conversation with the event. I love training, right? And so this worked out so well. We raised, with Jeff's help, more than $3,000 for a local network of food pantries, and we had an awesome event, and it was great. Okay, so never fear. If you get a no, just go ahead and ask people their concerns. Okay, so that's a bit about the book, and I wanted to share briefly with you my mission in writing the book. I have a few missions to share with you today. So the first is to serve people in every area of their lives. You know, I felt reading the other negotiation books that they missed part of the magic that we create in the room as mediators. How many people have said to you after you've mediated a case that watching you in action helped them realize that they could talk to their kids a different way, or gave them a sense of peace and confidence that they carried into their everyday lives? That, I think, is the most profound privilege and blessing of what we do, is that we give people tools that they can use across the board. And when I train mediators, it's the same thing. It's one of my favorite things to do, because I watch them, even as they acquire these skills, step into a fuller version of who they are, that they gain confidence and they gain skills that they can use in the rest of their lives as social justice activists, as a family member, and as people who are then navigating their careers. So this is part of my mission, because this is part of what mediators do. The next is not just to teach negotiation, but I see negotiation as a tool for empowerment and equity. What does that mean? It means that I work only with partners and on events where people are committed to using negotiation to help each person reach their highest and best, and also where we can come together to make sure that everybody has a meaningful, a real, not a symbolic seat at the table. And we are working together to create the kind of communities that we all want in this world. Third, as I mentioned, I wanted to teach people what mediation was. I have to tell you, one of the greatest sources of satisfaction in this book is that even some of my colleagues at Columbia Law School, when they read an early version, they were like, that's what mediation is. They didn't know. And so in the course of buying a book on negotiation, people are going to understand what mediation is. And I thought it was relevant because my whole approach to negotiation comes because I studied mediation first. I sat in the mediator chair first before I ever studied how to advocate for myself. And as a result, once I sat in the chair as a negotiator, I was thinking about, how do I use my words to bring people together? And so I wanted to bring that approach to the field of negotiation. Okay, I think we have somebody who is not on mute. I'm hearing a little bit of traffic, but that's okay. All right, last mission is to increase representation in the popular negotiation literature. So what does that mean? It means that when I first thought about writing a book and I had the idea to write a book, I was stepping into a field where there really is not a lot of representation. In fact, Simon & Schuster sent me a graphic when we were looking to come up with my cover. They said, okay, Alex, here are your comparable books. 8 books, 16 authors, and 1 woman in the 3rd author position on Difficult Conversations. Sheila Heen, who endorsed Ask for More, as did Doug Stone. They're really wonderful colleagues and friends. And so this was a little dispiriting, I'm not gonna lie, looking at this picture. And so I'm really proud that Ask for More is one of the only negotiation books out there that is solo authored by a woman. I've been fortunate to have a ton of support, both from women in the field, but also from men. And I would say, in fact, it's, some of my friendships with Jeff and others that have shown me that, it's not just women who are concerned with gender equity in negotiation and mediation, that we have champions out there who are going to stand with us and support us, not just by saying good for you, but by putting their name behind you and recommending you things. I've often heard that the difference between an ally and a sponsor is that an ally talks to you and a sponsor talks about you. They talk about you when you are not in the room, and they speak your name to people who otherwise would not have a chance to hear it. And so I would like to further that mission. Sometimes if I can't pay it back, what I do is I pay it forward. And so today I would like to introduce you to one of my friends who is a wonderful woman in the negotiation space. Anybody heard of her? I'm looking and I see, no, okay. Minda Harts is fantastic. She wrote a book and published it last year called The Memo: What Women of Color Need to Know to Secure Their Seat at the Table. This, may I say, is a wonderful book for white folks also to read. One of the things, in fact, that I learned from reading Minda's book, which I have a copy of, is that instead of using the word ally, which I just did and I need to work on, she uses the term success partner. And if we think of our work as mediators, what we do with people, we partner with them in their success. And so this is what Minda asks of us, that we see ourselves not as just passive allies, but that we partner with people, we do the work, we take the actions to be a full, co-owner in their success. Minda's book is available. Also, thank you so much. And I would really appreciate it if you guys would take a look at Minda and her work. I have seen her speak. We spoke together at a summit for women back in November. I thought she was incredibly impressive, and I've been impressed with all of her content since then, as well as her book. It's a quick read. And for those of you who would like to stay in touch with me, I would welcome that opportunity. I am on LinkedIn. I'm on Instagram if you also like, cooking videos and kid pictures. And I'm on my website, alexcarterasks.com. I have some free webinars on there as well around negotiating virtually and negotiating through crisis and work-life balance issues that are free and shareable and can be used by anybody as a resource. And so with that, I will stop my share and take any questions.
Alex, that was fantastic. I've heard your presentation several times, and I think today, as the late, great Little Richard might have put it, you let it all hang out. It was just terrific. I think we have a small and friendly enough group that there's no real need to moderate questions. I think if we just go one at a time, whoever would like to go first, please unmute yourself. We have a little over 10 minutes left. Let's have some questions and conversation, please.
Alex, I'd just like to say I really appreciate your presentation today. And the last couple of days, I spent a lot of time on your website, watching your videos, as well as in pretty much all of your interviews I found on YouTube. So very impressed. I particularly like the story when one of your interviewers asked, what's like your biggest blunder you made, and you shared about when you went home. If you wouldn't mind sharing that again.
So I apologize, David, you were breaking up for me. Was that happening for anybody else? Oh. Yeah, I didn't quite get your question, David. Thank you.
My question was, would you tell the story of your biggest blunder that you wrote about in the book, that when you went to Oklahoma and you were getting your rental car?
Oh, yeah. That's not my biggest, for a second when you said, would you tell the story of your biggest blunder? And I was like, I'm gonna have to go into the Rolodex here, David, because I've added a few since I wrote the book, let's put it that way. I feel like, in fact, I made a post on my Facebook timeline about how to apologize. Brene Brown has been talking about this because I feel like I've been stepping in it right and left. But yes, the first time I ever went to Oklahoma was with my co-professor at the time, Sean Watts, who is from Oklahoma and a member of the Cherokee Nation. And we were headed there to do some peacemaking observation of the tribe and their justice courts. And so I was a younger professor, much younger, and I was used to when people asked me what I did and I said I was a law professor, they would give me the look that some of the women are going to be familiar here with, which I call the slow blink, where people are like, like they can't believe that you know. Okay, so I had some baggage going into this encounter. So we get to the rental car company. I'm very tired. And the nice gentleman at the rental car company said, what do you do? And I said, here it comes. I'm a law professor. And he looked at me and asked me a 4-word question, which I'm going to put in the chat. He asked me that. what do you teach? Okay, now, anybody else here born in Brooklyn? I heard that. A comma. Does anybody know what that means? What do you teach? It means like, do you really teach? So instead of giving the answer, I said, yeah, I'm a law professor. And the guy froze, okay? And then my colleague Sean came in from the back and said, she teaches peace building. And I was like, oh, God. You know, so just a lesson that, you know, English is apparently my first language, okay? And yet it is so easy. We know this as mediators, right? Intent versus impact. And this had everything to do with the baggage that I was carrying into the room. Okay, this is a great question from Luis. What question do you ask parties? Okay, so you have a couple actually. What question do you ask to help them focus on long-term gains instead of short-term? Here's my answer to that. I actually talk about it in chapter 1, where I ask people, what's the problem you want to solve? Sometimes people give like a really small answer, like I need to get 3 clients this month, you know, or I need X amount of money. And I ask them this follow-up question, which is, what would happen if you achieved that? Or what would life look like if you achieved that? And that's my way of getting them to focus underneath the small, tangible, almost reactive definition of the problem to figure out sort of what, you know, is underneath that, or what the longer term goals are. Sometimes I'll ask people, you know, where they want to be in a couple of years, but I would say what would happen if you achieved that is a good way to get people beyond that immediate. Okay, so then we have some power imbalance questions, right? So how to balance power if you're the lower power party? Dea, this is a good question. There are a number of different techniques that I use depending on the situation. One of the things that I might like to do is I might like to negotiate over process. That's part of what the mediator helps people do, right? In fact, people get into the room, there's a power differential, and part of what we do is we procedurally help that situation. Now, if you don't have a mediator in the room, then I got to play mediator and be like, you know, Bob, I'm so excited to meet with you. Here are my hopes for this meeting, right? My hopes are, you know, I want to hear your perspective, and then I'd like to reserve, you know, the last 20 minutes to share with you some things that I'm bringing to the meeting, right? So in other words, if you're worried about getting crowded out, I would negotiate for your time and space. The other thing I like to do if there's a power imbalance is engage in a skill that I call acknowledgement, and which my mentor Carol Liebman calls stroking. It means recognizing somebody for their contributions or validating their feelings. Now, it has to be truthful, okay? So if Bob is has really not been a champion of my career, I don't want to go in and say, Bob, I want to thank you for being a champion of gender equity, if that's not the case. But I could go in and I could say, and I'm looking because there's no Bobs on the call, so I can just say that name with impunity. So I could go in and say, you know, Bob, I'm in here today because, like, your good word is indispensable for me as I move up the ladder. People listen to you. They are, oh, good, Day, I'm so glad. So if that's your ex-husband, we'll just go to town. We'll use Bob. That sounds great. So, right, so we might say, hey, Bob, like, you know, you're a leader in this company. Your word matters greatly. And so I know, right, that if you speak of me, that people will listen to you. And so that's why I'm here today, is to engage you as an ally and ask you for your help and advice as I move up the ladder. If you lead with that, right, Bob is much more likely to be like, oh, yes, in fact, I am, you know, a leader, and I'd love to help you, right? So acknowledgement, sometimes if somebody is being particularly challenging, we call them a stroking opportunity, right? So this is a person who's calling out for a little bit of acknowledgement. What questions do you ask parties to reflect on power imbalance at the table or balance the power at the table? You know, Luis, this is a good question. It's so context dependent. I will say, you know, sometimes I raise it beforehand. If one side, you know, if I'm mediating a case involving the US government and a complainant, okay, and the US government tells me they're going to bring 5 people to the table, the first thing I'm going to do is to say, thank you so much for your commitment. This is really great. You know, the impulse to have a lot of good problem solvers at the table, love it. I just want to ask for your advice here. I'm thinking through this. There's going to be 1 person on one side and 5 people on the other side. Can we talk about that? Because I'm wondering how that's going to play. And so we can sometimes process through together and figure out, okay, maybe if all of those people really are needed, maybe a couple of them are going to attend by phone. Maybe we offer the other person and say, do you want to bring a support person or whatever it might be to kind of balance that out. Otherwise, when I'm in the room, you know, again, as the mediator, I'm in the neutral chair, but there are a lot of things that I can do procedurally to balance things a little bit more. I slow it down. I play the newbie mediator. Could you explain that term for me? Could you break down what you mean when you say this, right? Helping to break down some of the jargon, helping to slow things down, helping to summarize and reframe is a great tool for that. I also, when I ask open questions and I'm moderating the early part of the discussion, it slows it down so everybody can participate. And finally, if I have a major power imbalance, I might caucus, you know, because I might want to, and I would say, even if it's been very civil, if I have an unrepresented person at the table, I want to caucus, I think, during the idea generation part of the mediation, because I want that person to have a space to process and like really think through their options without the pressure of the other lawyer sitting at the table. I received a private question about the challenge of mental illness. And I have dealt with this before many times. You know, I'm not a doctor, obviously. I just play one on YouTube. But, you know, in mediating in New York City courts and mediating employment cases, I've seen this. I've in fact really admired, sometimes I get people with mental illness who reserve it for caucus. So in joint session, they'll tell me there's been a pattern of harassment. And when I say, can you say a bit more about that? They reserve it. And then we get into caucus and they say, they're putting a chip in my brain, they're monitoring me through my television set, that type of stuff. You know, what I really, if legal rights are at stake, I'm generally not mediating that through to agreement. What I have done, you know, with the person who said they're part of a worldwide conspiracy, I did ask a few questions. I asked her to tell me more about the conspiracy. And then I asked her to tell me how she would know if the conspiracy had been called off. Because I wanted to see if maybe there was some kind of on-off switch, you know, inside. I also asked her, like, how would you know if I've been co-opted by the conspiracy? Because she told me that she would try to go into doctors and they would say they could help her and they would leave the room. And then when they came back, they were co-opted. So I got into some of the trust issues. I asked her if we could help her, you know, find a doctor that was not part of this. And then we called the session off, right? So I never challenge. I deal with that reality like I deal with any other reality. With respect, I summarize it, I ask questions, and I try to figure out the best way that I can help that person within my sphere of expertise, right? I wasn't gonna say to her, I think you've mental illness, see a doctor, but I did say, the weight of this seems enormously stressful. Have you been able to seek support? Right, so I can do that. Yeah, and finally, I got just a comment here, you know, about my story about Oklahoma, saying, you know, the idea is never assume, right? That I assumed what that gentleman meant when he said, what do you teach? And so really, I think, you know, it's a great thing. It's a reminder for us not to assume and to be curious. And finally, Michael said, it sounds like you're a fan of joint sessions. Yes, Michael, I am a fan of joint sessions. What I tell people a lot of times is joint sessions are efficient, right? We can get through a lot of material that other times, like if you want me to get a workout running back and forth between rooms, you know, sounds great and my genes will thank you. But otherwise, right, like if we want to spend time together And ultimately, you are the most impactful deliverer of your message, right? And so I do think there's great power in having people together in joint session. And one of the things I'm proud of as a mediator is, again, I've spent a lot of time in New York City courts. I can manage the conflict. I feel really confident that I can get two people together plus lawyers, and we can have at least an introductory session that helps people understand. This is the last thing I'll say. My husband is an in-house litigator, and he tried dealing with a case where the mediator kept them apart the whole time. And the complainant kept shifting the goalposts, right? And so he came to me and said, I can't talk about the case, but there's this dynamic. The complainant keeps saying, it's over here. No, it's over here. And I said, you know, the thing is, you got to meet her. You have to see her face to face to understand what she's about and what her hangup is, and have her see that you're a human being, not just a company. They met in person. They settled the case. All right. It's 12:01. This has been great. A couple people are
Alex,
signing.
thank you so much. We know you have a hugely busy schedule and are probably off to another interview. We want to be respectful of your time and everybody else's. Buy the book, ask for more, contribute to food banks if you like what you saw. And the other book you recommended, Alex, was The Memo.
The Memo, yes. It's
By-
What Women of Color by Minda Harts, which I am going to show you right here. MindaHarts.com. The Memo, What Women of Color Need to Know to Secure a Seat at the Table.
Great. Thank you, thank you, thank you. This was a fantastic hour.
And my father has recovered from COVID, it appears. So somebody just asked that
Beautiful.
question,
I'm really
and
happy to hear that.
thank you so much.
I'm happy
That's
to hear that,
beautiful.
Alex.
Okay, with that, bye-bye, everybody. We'll see you next week. Alex, thank you once again.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.